purpose of this talk is to tell you about effective strategies for accomplishing nefarious ends. When I say the benefits of, I don't mean these are morally good things. I mean these are things that work. Unfortunately, they work for, they have been used for, both historically and in America recently, they've been used for nefarious ends. I'm getting a lot of background noise. Could whoever that is please mute yourself? Thanks, sorry. They've been used for a lot of nefarious ends, specifically for subverting the American political system and America as a country, really, to accomplish power grabs and the oppression of various peoples and such. When I was working on this talk, I realized that a lot of it was basically going to be a list of definitions, which is a terrible structure for a talk. But I started thinking, why am I giving this talk? And I realized that it's because not everyone knows what everyone knows. That it's easy to assume that people are familiar with things like, the paradox of tolerance, or like, the big lie. I'm sure if I asked for a show of hands about who knows what the big lie technique is and who pioneered it, maybe a third to half the people here would raise their hands. And in younger and younger population groups, fewer and fewer, because it dates back to the Second World War, preceding the Second World War, actually. And it's a really important concept. For example, did you know that 83% of trans people have molested a child? 83%. Now, I'm sure some of you are going, oh, that's nonsense. Some of you are going, how could, well, Mickey's obviously trans. How could she say such a horrible thing? Well, partly is it's a complete lie. It's not 83%. So how much more likely are trans people to molest children than, say, straight men? I used another sneaky technique there. It's called embedded presuppositions. If I say how much more, you might think, well, 1% more, 3% more, 10% more. No, way less. Straight men are much, much, much more likely to molest children than trans people of either gender. But because I asked the question as how much more, it makes it much harder for people to go, well, it's really less. People immediately think, well, maybe, how much more? And it's very hard to get people to unconvince themselves. In fact, since I started this with the big lie that 83% of trans people have molested children, at the end of this talk, you will probably remember it as trans people molest children. Because people have a really hard time recalculating their conclusions, even if the facts they are based on are proven to be false. People draw conclusions based on information. And then when that information is proven to be false, nonetheless, they retain the conclusions they drew. You might wonder, by the way, why I picked trans people and child molestation and other horrible things as my example there. Well, I picked trans people as the example because it's the group that I can't reasonably be accused of being biased against or giving hate speech about, being trans myself. And I picked child molestation because that's what the right wing has been accusing trans people of. Protect the children from those horrible trans people. Surely they're all child molesters. There's a classic aphorism, where there's smoke, there's fire. And Hitler's big lie technique, and by the way, that is actually true, the big lie technique comes from Hitler. He would give speeches where he'd say, Jews sacrifice babies for blood rituals. Well, do Jews sacrifice babies? Do Jews sacrifice babies for blood rituals? Of course not. But and the funny thing is, most Germans knew that. But surely, if Hitler was saying these awful things about Jews, even if those things weren't true, something bad must be true. And that's the heart of the big lie technique, by the way. If you say something outrageous enough, then people will assume there's something there. If you say, there's a ring of high-level Democrats molesting children in the basement of a pizza joint in New Jersey, somewhere. Now, obvious nonsense. And yet it became the foundation of the whole QAnon phenomenon that high-level Democrats had a ring of crime, ring of leaders committing sex crimes. That started with a big lie. It started with some wacko on the internet going, "Oh my God, there's this pizza joint in New Jersey." But because of the big lie technique, what people took away from that is, well, maybe it's not the basement of a pizza joint, maybe it's not New Jersey, but seriously, high-level Democrats, did you hear? Right? You've seen that technique a lot. One of the interesting things is how people get away with the big lie technique. I could say something like, oh, Vice President Vance likes to dance naked around a bonfire while filleting goats. He really does. He goes out there and he dances with goats and fillets them. It's disgusting. And if you said, well, how dare you say that? That's slander. Oh, come on, like I intended that to be taken seriously. By the way, did you know that some people are saying J.D. Vance? The more extreme the claim, the more you can say, oh, well, clearly it was just for the purpose of parody. Clearly I was making an absurd example, speaking hyperbolically. Nobody could ever believe that, so it can't have been a slander. And yet the big lie technique guarantees that people will walk away thinking there's something there about J.D. Vance and goats, right? Something? Who knows? Maybe it's dancing. Maybe J.D. Vance likes to dance around bonfires. That's kind of like a satanic ritual, right? People walk away with that because of the extremism of the comment. See, this wonderful sort of confluence of strategies here, where you can duck under the slander laws, the laws that stop you from saying, this person did this horrible thing. If you make it horrible enough, you can go, well, it was clearly meant to be absurd. And then you can say things that are really, really extreme, and people sort of think, well, the truth must be at least something in that direction. And that brings us to our next rhetorical fallacy, which is the argument to moderation, fallacy of the mean, split the difference. And by the way, so the first logical fallacy, rhetorical technique, was the big lie technique that Hitler innovated. Say something truly outrageous, and people walk away thinking there must be something bad true, even if clearly not that absurdly outrageous thing, right? So what is the argument to moderation, or the fallacy of the mean? And the idea there is, well, if this person says A and this person says Z, then the truth must be somewhere in the M or N region. Well, suppose the truth is B. Someone says A, someone says Z. There's actually no connection between where these positions are placed and where the truth falls. And yet this fallacy is what leads to things like, news organizations giving equal time to climate change deniers and climate scientists who actually know that climate change is anthropogenic, is caused by humans. John Oliver did a wonderful demonstration of this, or rather contravention of this, when he had 2 people come on stage and 98 people come on stage. And the 2 people are the 2% of climate scientists who claim that global warming isn't anthropogenic, and the 98 people are the 98% of climate scientists who know damn well that it's anthropogenic. And when you look at that, 2 people here and 98 freaking people over here, it's obvious that climate change denialists are the fringe. In this case, I would say the lunatic fringe, but that's my own personal bias, perhaps. But that's a really, and yet what you see when you watch the news is you'll see people going, well, here we have a climate change denialist, and here we have a climate change advocate. Let's hear from both of them. We don't hear 98% of their time dedicated to this position, 2% to this. We hear, well, let's hear from both sides. And one of the problems with hear from both sides is that, again, the more extreme the position, the more it shifts people's expectations toward the extreme side. If I really want you to believe the answer is somewhere in the M or N range, and I know it's actually, G, right? You'd think I'd want to go fairly close to G, right? I think it's G, I'm going to argue for G, right? But someone else who really wants it to be further up, wants people to believe it's, Y, They say Z, 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 and people just sort of average them. And this, unfortunately, is something that has to be laid at the feet of the news media. Because in the first Trump campaign, we still had an independent press. And yet the independent press, I literally, in the entire duration of that campaign, I did not see one piece of mainstream media use the word lie about the lies Trump was telling. I was watching for it because he would say these completely absurd, provably false statements. And the news media report is, well, Trump says this and other people say that. Not, Trump just told a bald-faced lie about Clinton. I think we would have had very different results from that election if, in fact, people had been treated with the amount of respect their position actually deserved, rather than, well, clearly we need to represent both sides. Equal time to both sides is, in fact, a fallacy. It's great for ratings. People love to hear a big debate, impassioned debate, and the more extreme the positions, the more impassioned the debate. But it's bad for truth, because people, and by people I mean all of us here, we're all people, we're all subject to these fallacies. People believe that the truth must be about halfway in between the two extremes, which means that people arguing in good faith on one side lose the outcome of the argument, because the people who are not arguing in good faith can go as extreme as they want. And again, we see extremism. So why don't people just start out saying all those immigrants are rapists? If you go back a couple of decades and you say all the illegal immigrants from Mexico are rapists, people would have been shocked and horrified. Oh my God, how can you say that? It was way beyond the pale. And people do tend to react negatively to stuff that's way beyond the pale, right? Unless you sort of edge your way up toward it. There's something called the ratchet effect, where it's harder to walk back a change. Once you get people to take seriously the claim that, oh, undocumented immigrants commit more crimes, or even to agree it's okay to say that. By the way, undocumented immigrants don't commit more crimes. They commit way fewer crimes, way fewer, which makes sense if you think about it. If they commit any crime at all, they get deported. So of course they're going to be careful. But if you start making it, if it becomes okay to say that undocumented immigrants are much more likely to commit crimes, or even a little more likely to commit crimes, and people don't challenge you on it, then suddenly you're one step further. Now it's okay to say not just that, but a little bit worse than that. Now it's all undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crimes. Now it's all undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit serious crimes. Now they're all terrorists. Now we're invading Venezuela because we claim they're terrorists. Stop and think about that for a minute. How did we end up invading a sovereign nation to steal their oil with no one complaining about it? With no one in power complaining about it? Because we started with, well, undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crimes. Step by step, we shifted what we call the Overton window, which is the window of things it's permissible to say out loud. And the Overton window started out with undocumented immigrants are good for the country because our immigrant population has always helped our economy. And on the other side, undocumented immigrants, or as they would say, illegal immigrants, are bad for the country because they are, because they are, I don't know what, stealing from us. They are, they're not paying taxes. They do pay taxes. They are, they're lazy. They're not lazy. They work harder. But these were claims you could make if you wanted to. And then they went one step beyond that. Now we're hearing Trump saying, well, and they're rapists and they're murderers, and some of them I'm sure are very fine people. That was not somewhere Trump magically went from, good, bad immigrants to they're rapists and murderers. We got there step by step. They're bad for the country for economic reasons. They're bad for the country because they're more likely to commit crimes. They're bad for the country because they are criminals. They're bad for the country because they are murderers and rapists. And some of them, I'm sure, are very fine people. The Overton window shifts until it becomes reasonable sounding to say there are massive terrorist gangs run by governments that are poisoning our children with fentanyl. and it's the Venezuelans, and we're going to invade their country to stop these terrorist gangs. Stop and think about that. We're going to invade a foreign country to stop a terrorist gang. Does that make sense to anyone? That kind of shocks me. Think about how you would have reacted, again, a decade ago. If someone had said, Obama says, well, we're going to invade a foreign country because their government sponsors terrorist gangs that we can't control any other way. So they're an existential threat to America, and we have to invade them and steal their oil. At least back in, 20 years ago, we had to claim we thought they had weapons of mass destruction, even though we knew they didn't. At least then we had, the plausible argument that they had weapons of mass destruction. Even when it was later proven that we knew they didn't, people still think that we invaded Iraq because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. Again, people don't recalculate their conclusions when the data they're based on is proven to be false. Not only do we now know they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, we know that W knew that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We know that they knew for a fact that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. That can't have been why we invaded. But people still think we invaded because they had or because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. Because the Overton window has shifted. And now it's not, did our government commit an act of violent aggression and invasion of another country under the pretext of a lie? Even though we now know that that's the fact. That's the facts, people. That's what we did. But because the lie we were told was, they have weapons of mass destruction, and then, well, we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. Now most people assume that the truth is somewhere between we thought they had weapons of mass destruction and we knew they had weapons of mass destruction. And when the facts change, when the proven facts change, and now we know that we actually knew they didn't, people still think it's somewhere over here. These rhetorical techniques reinforce each other. The big lie technique shifts the Overton window. The fallacy of the mean, the argument to moderation, moves people's assumptions about where the truth is. And the fact that people don't recalculate their conclusions when the facts underlying them change creates a ratcheting effect, where the more we move toward the extremist side, the less extreme it sounds, because we're carrying around these conclusions we drew based on those big lies. They're not just rhetorical techniques. Some of them are linguistic techniques. Some of them are psychological techniques. Some of them are political techniques. Subverting the party apparatus. There's a reason why we are viewed as a two-party system. And that's because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have these massive organizations. They know people at the local area. They have coordination at the state and national level. They have all of these party apparatuses, whatever, these mechanisms under the ownership of the party, such that if anybody can get the Republican nomination, they're guaranteed the support of all of these tools. So, but how do you subvert an entire political party? Well, one answer is what we call the Nazi bar analogy. A lot of bikers aren't, racist. So there's this image of bikers as, these bearded, redneck, racist. Well, no, not really. That's just an image people have of bikers. It's not what bikers are like. But bikers do, it turns out, like to gather in biker bars. They like to have a place where they can all pull up on their motorcycles and, show off their cool motorcycles and sit around and drink beer with their friends and have a nice time at the biker bar. And something that bikers have known for a long time is that if a Nazi comes into your bar, you have to kick him out right then. Someone comes into your bar and starts talking about them racial group, you got to kick them out right then. Because if you don't, people who hate racists will leave because they don't want to sit down with racists. And then more racists come in because there are fewer people to kick them out. And before you know it, you have a Nazi bar. You don't have your nice biker bar anymore, you have a Nazi bar. And so bikers have learned, kick the Nazis out the first time they show up. Unfortunately, the Republican Party didn't have a mechanism for kicking racists out. Because going back to the Southern strategy, the Republican Party had been inviting racists in. Ever since the Civil Rights Act, the Republican Party has been embracing it's called the Southern strategy, Google it. embracing racism as a power fueling votes. Well, when you do that, you don't have mechanisms for kicking the racists out. Even when those racists start waving freaking swastikas at your party organization, at your gatherings, at their rallies. We paid in massive amounts of blood to defeat the Nazis in World War II. And honestly, I mean, I wasn't close to alive then. I'm old, I'm not that old. But it makes me sick to see Musk giving a Nazi salute. It makes me sick to see the swastika flying at a rally, an actual mainstream party rally in America. It's disgusting. But it happens. And it happens because, well, okay, fine. No, we have the vote of the anti-black racists in the South. Okay, fine. Now we have the vote of people who are, they're part of, white nationalist organizations. We won't call them Nazis. We call them white nationalists. Ignoring their rhetoric and the fact that they use the swastika as their symbol. Well, now it's okay to actually let them show their flag, because they have a free speech right to show their flag, right? Well, now, oh look. Because there's a saying that if you have 11 people at a table and a Nazi sits down and no one else gets up, you have 12 Nazis at the table. Let me read a quote for you here. It's a quote from A.R. Moxon. Historians have a word for Germans who joined the Nazi Party, not because they hated Jews, but out of a hope for restored patriotism, or a sense of economic anxiety, or a hope to preserve their religious values, or dislike of their opponents, or raw political opportunism, or convenience, or ignorance, or greed. That word is Nazi. Which means that a lot of people who were part of the Republican Party, but were not willing to make common cause with Nazis, left the party, leaving the party even more in the hands of Nazis and making it more likely to welcome in people who were overtly white nationalist, aka Nazi racist, people who were overtly flying the swastika. Because the more it became a party that tolerated Nazis, the more people left who weren't Nazis, and the more open it was to having more Nazis. And that's how we got to Musk giving the Nazi salute and being roundly cheered for it. Which puts people who were Republicans for reasons like, wanting to preserve their religious values or dislike of their opponents or raw political opportunism or convenience or ignorance or greed, those people who might have otherwise left are put in a quandary. If they leave, they're leaving the party apparatus in the hands of Nazis. If they stay, they become Nazi supporters. And, historically, you actually can't tell apart the Nazi supporters from the Nazis because they're all wearing the swastika on their sleeves. How did they get there? Well, the ratchet effect. First, we don't mind if we quietly welcome people who are blatantly racist, people who are quietly racist. Well, now we can quietly welcome people who are overtly racist. Well, now that everyone knows we're quietly welcome, we can welcome them out loud. We don't believe what you do, but we'll make common cause with you for the sake of America. America. Ratchet effect moves on until we welcome the people with the swastikas because they're our friends. And the only people left to say that are the people who already believe that's okay. I'm going to check the time here. I'm pretty much out of time, and I'm only about halfway through the list of rhetorical techniques and fallacies, which is, that's what happens when there are this many. Oh, one of them is the strategy of bullshit. You keep saying extreme nonsensical things, and there's only enough time to argue against half of them. The other half must be true, right? No one argued. Well, you spew enough bullshit, and again, big lie effect. People don't recalculate the conclusions when it's disproven. You say 1,000 things. There's only time to dispute 500. People draw conclusions based on the other 500. And now you have all the conclusions of all of those extremist lies walking around in people's heads. What stops that from happening? Why is this only happening now? Because we used to have robust mechanisms to prevent it. News organizations were legally required to only say true things. You actually, it was a violation of the law to get up there on your, evening news hour and talk about things that were false. There was election fraud, right? There was election fraud. No, there wasn't. There wasn't election fraud. There have been 2 cases of election fraud proven, and both of them were against Republicans. There was no election fraud. People think there was because Fox News, the word news there, you'd think Fox News is a news channel subject to that law. No, they went to court and said, we're not, we're entertainment. People know we aren't telling the truth. People watch us because it's funny, right? You remember, you know how J.D. Vance dances around bonfires at night, naked, being filleted by goats, or was it filleting goats? Maybe both. Who knows? People say, I hear people say there's a lot of naked bonfire dancing in the Vance community, right? Again, that's not true, but it's something extreme enough that some of you are probably thinking, we're human, we make these mistakes ourselves. Now we're wondering, well, why would people say that? Does he actually dance naked around bonfires? What kinds of things is he doing with goats, right? But obviously I don't believe he does. That's absurd. I said as an example of extremism, nobody could believe it. Nobody could believe Fox News. It has the word news right there, but since it's obviously parody, nobody could believe it. And Fox News had license to say things as extreme as they wanted on the news. Alex Jones could say the Sandy Hook parents were paid crisis actors designed to give people to allow people to pretend that gun control is reasonable. It took them decades to shut him down. Decades and $1 billion judgment. And last I heard, he was still talking on the news, on the radio. He was still talking because he managed to get his billions tucked away in other people's ownership before the judgment came due. And I was like, I don't have any money to pay it. Sorry. By the way, I'll be over here talking about stuff on other people's shows. We used to have mechanisms that prevented this. We used to have conventions that everyone followed, like when the president nominates someone for the Supreme Court, we debate it and we allow a vote. The world would be very different. It would be a very different place if Obama's Supreme Court candidate had been even considered. But if you're willing to violate those norms, if you're willing to push the Overton window, to tick the ratchet, one more tick in that direction, step by step, you can get to some pretty extreme places, like, invading a foreign country, explicitly stating that we're there to exploit their oil resources. You get things like women being arrested and charged with fetal violence for aborting their own fetus. Charged with child abuse because the police think that a miscarriage might have been an abortion. Who would have thought that was possible 15 years ago? We had Roe v. Wade. We were safe. We didn't do about abortion rights. They could talk all they wanted, but we had the right to abortion. No, not anymore. And now we literally are having police arrest women for miscarriages. How did we get here? We got here because people were willing to use techniques like Hitler's big lie. Because humans are susceptible to fallacies like the argument to moderation. Because the news organizations gave equal time to both sides. Was Hillary Clinton accountable, or was she merely someone who liked to kill people? Right? By the fact that people don't recalculate their conclusions when the truths underpinning them are proven to be lies. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. If we find out that, in fact, Maduro had nothing at all to do with the drug trade, people would still think that we invaded Venezuela to stop the terrorists. Why? Because people don't recalculate their conclusions when the facts underlying them change. I wish I had good answers. All we have to do is push this button and things will be better. I don't. Because this is an entire network of mutually supportive rhetorical techniques. But at least we can be aware of them when we see them. At least we can remember when someone makes one claim and someone else makes another, look at things like how many people are making this claim versus how many are making this one. Look at things like, what's the evidence that isn't these claims? Am I being manipulated by the fallacy of the mean? to think the truth is somewhere in between them. Why am I hearing from this extreme when only 1 in 100 or 2 in 100 climate scientists believe this? Why am I hearing from this one as much as from the 98% over here who disagree with them? Right? We can do things like, if someone makes a completely absurd, awful statement far beyond belief, think about why. Now you know they may be using the big lie technique. They may be using the where there's smoke, there's fire assumption to get people to think in this direction, right? When Trump says, they're murderers and rapists, and some of them I'm sure are nice people, you got to think, well, why is he saying that illegal immigrants are murderers and rapists? Oh, maybe it's a big lie. Let's look at the statistics. All right, way fewer crimes are committed by undocumented immigrants than by citizens. When someone says, whatever percent of trans people are child molesters, stop and think, well, what do the statistics actually say? Oh, wait, they say that the vast majority of child molesters are cisgendered white men. Vast majority. Trans people, really low rates of child molestation. What are you going to walk away from this remembering? Well, at least some of you are going to walk away from it going, wow, those Republicans really were onto something about the trans people as child molesters, maybe a little bit, because surely, at least some of them are, probably more than the cisgendered white people, cisgendered male white people, it's not true, but it's how human brains work. So be aware of it. Take a minute and think, wow, trans people are less likely to molest children. If you have a trans person come in for a story hour reading to kids at your library, they are safer than if the minister of the local church comes in. Because church ministers have a higher rate of child molestation than trans people do. By the way, I did not check that statistic. I made it up. It may not be true. I don't even know. It may be that church leaders are really great about child molestation rates. It makes news when they molest children. Maybe that's because it's so rare and so shocking. But I said it. And so some of you probably went, oh, wow, that's really true. And maybe what you remember in a month or two is church leaders are more likely to molest children than trans people. And you bring that up in your discourse. And suddenly the Overton window has shifted a little bit in the other direction. I don't think that's a good thing, by the way. I don't actually approve of lies. So again, I'm going to say I made that statistic up. I have no reason to believe it. Some people say, God, I can't even do that with a straight face. And that's one of the disadvantages that people of good intent have, is that we can't use these same tools. We have to use other tools like logic and rationality. You hear someone make a claim that's really shocking, like church leaders are more likely to molest children than trans people are? Ask yourself, what's their agenda? Oh, wait, that's a trans person saying it. Does she have an agenda? Maybe she's trying to actually defend trans people unfairly, right? Ask yourself, well, is that true? Do I have other resources? I don't know. I could have Googled that. I could have Googled, child molestation rates among trans people, child molestation rates among church leaders. I'd have the answer. I didn't bother because it was just a great example of something I just made up off the top of my head, but I could. So you should, go ahead, look it up, find out. Don't just take it on faith. And when you find out that that isn't true, take the time to stop and go, that isn't true. That was made up. That's not true. Actually, it's the other way around. Or actually, there are no reliable statistics on that. Or whatever the truth is, take the time to recalculate your conclusions. Take the time to think, to fight against these tendencies that we as human beings have, to give equal time to both sides, no matter how extreme one of them is, to assume that people are arguing in good faith when they say, child molestation rings in the basement of pizza parlors in New Jersey or wherever it was. Take the time to think, am I being manipulated by the big lie? Am I being manipulated by an embedded presupposition? What percentage of illegal immigrants is it okay to put in concentration camps? That leads to a very different discussion than, is it okay to put undocumented immigrants into concentration camps? If you say to people, is it okay to put undocumented immigrants into concentration camps? you'll probably get a fairly high percentage of, no, it's not okay. But if you ask people, what percentage of illegal immigrants is it okay to put into concentration camps? A lot of people are going to say, well, certainly no more than the ones who are really bad criminals, or certainly no more than 1 or 2%. Certainly only the ones that don't have kids. Very few people are going to go 0%, because you've framed the question with a presupposition that it's okay to put some percentage of them into concentration camps. So look at how people are framing the questions. You know, which terrorist is it okay to torture? Let's try that again. Is it okay to torture people we think are terrorists? The answer, by the way, is no. No, it's not okay. It's stupid, ineffective, morally vile, and cruel. But once people started arguing about which terrorists it was okay to torture, we were acknowledging that it was okay to ship people to foreign prisons where they would be tortured, like we are now doing with people we say are undocumented immigrants. How did we get to a country where men in masks are hauling citizens into black unmarked vans and kidnapping them and holding them for weeks? How did we get there? How did we become a country where our government sends masked men in black vans to arrest people on the streets with no proof of cause and no due process rights? Because after all, they're accused of being undocumented immigrants, so they don't get due process. How did we get there? We got there by people manipulating techniques, these and just the ones just like them, manipulating them to shift our thinking, our decision-making, our beliefs, what we say, what we check against against facts versus just accepting, what conclusions we draw, how we vote, who we put in power, shifting them steadily in one direction, ratcheting up the pressure and ratcheting down the truth and the honesty and the ethics. Let's start being part of the solution. Let's start calling these things out, at least in our own minds, and when possible, to other people as well. Don't let them control what you think using known mendacious techniques. Don't do it. Learn what these tools are that they are using and stop letting them gain the benefits of saying these horrifying things and getting other people to think something half as horrifying and 1,000 times as untrue as the truth. Thanks, everyone.